Thank you for the applause. It was like a nice rolling applause. That was beautiful. All right, thanks for coming back. You have caffeine in your system now, so we are ready to go here. Here's the plan. I just want to give you the plan as we go forward. We're almost at 4 o'clock. I know our drop dead time is 10 after 5. So I'm going to talk for a while, and we're going to kind of move into thinking about Charles Taylor's work and what it means to live in a secular age. And the way this is going to feel, I guess, as we come to a close, I'm going to go for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have a good 20 minutes of conversation. I think you have to talk this stuff through because it's a little bit complicated. So that'll give us ample time to pick up your questions, to try to connect this to things. But these 2 presentations, and then the next 2 that I'll give, do you remember, some of you maybe are too young, but do you remember when you saw The Lord of the Rings in the movie theater? Do you remember this? That you went, I think it was over a holiday, and you went and you watched it, and it was like 3 hours and 20 minutes. It was longer than the Irishman movie. I mean, it was long, remember? And then it ends where Frodo turns and says, now we're going to have to take this ring up the mountain. And then the credits roll, and you're like, what? I watched 3 hours for the movie to start? That's how this presentation is going to feel a little bit, all right? Can't promise it's going to be as good as Lord of the Rings. But what I mean by that is I'm going to go for a while, and then I'm just going to pull the curtain on this, and we're going to pick it up tomorrow. So what I want you to do is at like 2 in the morning, wake up and look at the ceiling and be like, but where is he going with this? You'll never do that, but it will make me feel good that you might. So that's where we're going to go. It's going to feel a little bit like we're going to stop abruptly, but then we'll pick it up as we try to lay out this story. Now, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit of Charles Taylor. I'm not going to reference Charles Taylor's name as much until we get to tomorrow. But I do want to say that when you think about this McGill philosopher's work, it does feel a little bit like this GIF I found on the internet. Now, this is going to take you a second to get this, but this is my favorite thing I found on the internet. So just hang in there and watch this. But I hope this presentation doesn't feel like this. That basically sums up. I love it so much. I could literally watch this all day long. For some of you, that's exactly how your seminary education felt. Like, I got it, where did it go? All right, so that could happen in this presentation, but we're going to hope it doesn't. But there we go. All right, so I want to explore with you really 2 big why questions. We could keep this at 1, but you all look like you are a smart group, so I want us to have 2 big why questions. And the first why question is, why is it so hard to do faith formation? Why is it so hard? And the second one, which I think is connected, but maybe a little bit different, but we'll pick it up as well, is why is it so hard today to be a pastor? Why is it so hard to be a pastor? I go to a lot of events like this. It's always a blessing to be at them. And usually about every other one, I will have someone come up to me after a presentation, and I will become their confessor. They will confess to me. And it's usually, this is a composite, but it's usually this kind of person. It's someone who is in about 15 years of ministry. Usually they are the lead pastor, maybe solo pastor, maybe it's a multi-staff church, and they are the senior pastor. They'll come up to me, and they'll say these words. In absolute kind of confession, they'll say, I got to tell you, I have no idea what I'm doing. And then there'll be a kind of a sense of sadness with it. And they'll say, I have no idea what I'm actually doing. And then they'll kind of snap back into some confidence and say, well, actually, I'm a pretty good pastor. You look at my church, we're at a little bit of a level of increase. I run a good meeting. I think I preach a really good sermon. But then the unease will come back. The malaise will come back, and they'll say, but to be honest, I have no idea really what I'm doing. And I think we live in a time where this why question, why does it feel so hard to be a pastor, and why is faith formation, is really on the surface. Now, I just want to answer it right off the bat, and I think why it's so hard is because of the secular. Now, thank you very much. It's been really nice to meet you all. I'm just going to sit down. So I think that's the answer why it's so hard is because of the secular. But here's the problem. To say the secular, or we could say it this way, the secular is a very multivalent word. And we all kind of know what we mean when we say the secular. If you were at coffee and you said, the reason faith formation is so hard is because of the way the secular impacts our young people or impacts their parents, we would all kind of know what you're talking about, but there's also a lot of difference. We're really not sure what we mean by the secular. So I want to try to unfold this word a little bit for us, and we're going to unfold it for a while, and then we'll just stop for the day, and we'll pick it up and look at the ramifications for this. So let's unfold it and what we mean by the secular. If we wanted to go back in time, we could think about a world before there was a secular. And we could call this secular zero, if you want to call it that. A world before the secular, a world without the secular. It's hard for us even to imagine such a world, but there was a world that once existed, at least in the Western world, that you could go back to a time essentially before the secular. Of course, people had a sense of what was sacred and what was profane. Everyone, say, in 13th century Paris knew that a priest chalice that they gave the Eucharist with was sacred, and a farmer's hoe was profane or maybe a secular thing. But for the most part, these things were one whole cloth. I don't know if you know the statue of this person or know who this is. This is a statue that you can find in Venice, and it's a statue of a man named Paolo Sarpi. And one of the reasons Paolo Sarpi is so famous is because he was Galileo's friend and really encouraged Galileo to publish his work. But you can find this in Venice if you can go, and you should before climate change takes it away, which is a very sad comment. But you can find this statue, and underneath it there'll be some Italian words, and it will say Paolo Sarpi, when he was born, when he had died, and then the quote, and you'll have to stop someone on the side of the street to have them translate it for you from Italian, but it will say Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation. That's a very different kind of age to live in. That you would receive notoriety back, this is 16th century, early 16th century, to have notoriety for being the only believer in your generation. Now just imagine if they had a statue for every unbeliever in Winnipeg. You wouldn't be able to drive down the street, or Minneapolis. You wouldn't be able to find it. But this was a world, why this existed this way, so it was a world without the secular. For the most part, the secular didn't exist at all. To be, say, a Parisian was to participate in the Mass. It was to take the Eucharist. These were all one in the same. In the whole society, faith formation, I don't want to say it was easy, but it was almost unthought. I mean, certain people thought about it, but the whole society, in many ways, formed faith in people. The only example I can give us of this, a thought experiment, to think about this in our context now, what it would be like to live in a secular zero world after modernity, is this little show that's quite a freaky show called The Handmaid's Tale. Does anyone watch The Handmaid's Tale? And at least in the States, it's on Hulu. Is it? What is it when you watch it? Is it on? Okay. So anyhow, this is based off the novels by Margaret Atwood, good Canadian author. And this is an example of a secular zero world. Now, I don't know if you've seen the show. If you need not to sleep tonight and just want to be freaked out, you should stream this tonight because it is quite freaky. What has happened in the show is that America has been taken over by a fundamentalist religious group. And actually, America doesn't exist anymore. A new place called Gilead exists. Well, that's not true. America does exist, but it's embedded in Toronto, which seems to me just to be the ultimate Canadian fantasy. Doesn't it? That America no longer exists except a little group in Toronto, and we get to set terms for everything of the others. So it doesn't exist. It exists inside of Toronto, and this Gilead group has overtaken it, and it really is this sense of secular zero. And if you watch the show, one of the things that's most haunting is the way people dress, the way people talk, perpetuates belief. So you essentially, every interaction reenacts the liturgy every day. And it's freaky for us late modern people to see, but they go into the grocery store and they say, the greeting to one another is, may the Lord open under his eye. That there's just a complete whole cloth between life and belief. These things are all held together, that there really is a kind of sense of secular zero. Now, I talked to a lot of denominational officials, a lot of people who are worried about the decline in church membership, a lot of people who don't know what the future of the church is going to be. None of them across Europe and across, at least in America, maybe it's different here in Canada, but none of them have said to me, you know what we need? We just need to figure out a way to get to the Handmaid's Tale. I mean, if we could just have our churches be like the Handmaid's Tale, then everything would be okay. Nobody wants that. And actually, Margaret Atwood thinks it is an absolute horror to think about this world coming. And one of the reasons she thinks it's a horror is because you need three things that we just don't have anymore to have a secular zero world. And these three things you need is you need a sense of enchantment. You need a deep sense that things themselves are enchanted or hold power or hold magic. And then the self has to be porous. Now, let's start at the top in that you have to have a sense that the world is an enchanted place. Now, there's been a lot of historical work done that's really quite fascinating. That in England, I think this was around the 14th, 15th century, one of the biggest pastoral crises that was going on were that they discovered people were going to the cathedral to take the Eucharist, and it was being put into their mouth, and they discovered that there were some people who were leaving the cathedral without swallowing the host. And they were taking it out, and they were feeding it to their sick pigs, and they were putting it on their fields because they had a deep sense that this was magical. The theologians and the priests never had a sense necessarily that this was magical, but the common people had a deep sense that this was magical. So if you had a sick pig and your life was dependent on it, wouldn't you want to get this magical thing out and feed it to them? So the pastors and the priests and the bishops gathered, and they've had to figure out something to do, and they figured out the best technological breakthrough to solve this problem was just to make people stick out their tongues. And this is why still if you watch an Irish gangster film, sometimes you'll see the priest puts the host on the person's tongue. You have to put your hands behind your back because this is a powerful, powerful thing, so you can't even touch it. You stick out your tongue, the priest puts it on your tongue, and then you have to open your mouth and show that you've swallowed it, like you're a 6-year-old with a sore throat at the doctor's office, so that they can make sure that this powerful thing was actually taken in. Now, as time went on, and these theologians ramped up the importance of not misusing and abusing the host, it became to such a point that many people didn't want to take communion or take the Eucharist at all. And it became church law that you had to take it twice a year. And as Charles Taylor reports, most people took it twice a year. It was frightening, the thought of it. It would be similar today if one of you wanted to just make an announcement to us and you stood up and said, hey, I just want you all to know that tomorrow I'm not going to be here because tomorrow I have to have my appendix taken out. And then you were to say, I just got to tell you all, I love having my appendix out. I mean, I've never had it done before, but I love surgery, and I love anesthesia, and I just love the thought of someone cutting my body open and taking something out of it. I just love that. I mean, it's so meaningful to me. We would all think there was something wrong with you, that you were a little bit off. It would be similar, analogically, to people back in the 14th, 15th century saying they love taking communion. It makes them feel so good. Most people were absolutely frightened of it. They were going to take a holy thing into their sinful being, and it could rip them apart. But just like the same reason you'd have your appendix out, the alternative is worse. The alternative of not taking it is that you could burn in hell forever, so you would take it. It's a very different imagination we have in our cultural context. So I have a son who's 15. His name's Owen. I just have to say this up front. He is a lovely, lovely boy. Lovely boy. A complete pain in the ass, but a lovely, lovely boy. I mean, like complete 100%. Beautiful kid. I would die for this boy, but I want to strangle him like Homer Simpson to Bart most days of the week. Beautiful kid. So my wife is a Presbyterian pastor, and in our little church in South Minneapolis, we take communion in a circle together. There's just about 40 of us, and we take it. It's a beautiful practice. The bread and the wine come around, and you are to take it, and you are to serve the elements to the person next to you. So you're to say to the person, look them in the eye and say their name, the body of Christ broken for you. So we're standing across the circle, and the elements start coming along. And my 15-year-old son at this one beautiful Sunday turns to me and says, hey, he whispers to me and says, is that bread gluten-free? Now, you have to know he has a moral aversion towards anything gluten-free because his mother is gluten-free. So that just means de facto it is bad. So he's coming along, and I almost don't even want to answer. And he says, is that bread gluten-free? The bread of our Lord and Savior. He asks, is it gluten-free? And I say without looking at him, because I know this is going to be a problem, I say, yeah, it is. And he says to me, he looks at me and he says, I'm out. Turns around and walks out of church. I confess to you people right now, it took everything in me to not turn around, tackle him, and beat him in front of the church right there. But think of that radical difference just over 500-600 years of people trembling of the thought of having to take the Eucharist to my 15-year-old beautiful boy saying, I'm out. If it's gluten-free, I'm completely out. So we have this complete different kind of imagination where we no longer live in this deep sense of enchantment. We can talk about that more because one of the things we'll discover is we're never quite as modern as we think we are. But there is this sense where we don't have this kind of enchanted realm like we once did. Doesn't mean people don't still feel these experiences. Doesn't mean that people don't individually have them, but they don't seem to be filed in a larger meaning system like would have been there in a secular zero world. I think all of us would agree if you get on an airplane the next time you get on it, and if you back off of the gate, and then the pilot goes to the runway, if the pilot ever got on the microphone and said, "Hey folks, hey, I just want to tell you, we're going to go back to the gate. My co-pilot and I, we've just been up here, and we're just getting some vibes that there are some bad demons up in the sky, and we're just not sure our engines are really going to take it. We're just going to have the holy men and women put some more holy water on these engines before we go. All right, it's just going to be about a 20-minute delay." All of us would freak out. This is just not the world that we inherit and we live in. So you need this sense of enchantment. The other thing you need to live in a secular zero world is you need the sense that things themselves are fused with meaning. In a secular zero world, in some sense, faith formation is really easy because how would you do it? Like functionally, practically, how would you do faith formation? I mean, this is an overstatement, but essentially what you do is you just get people to the relics. Just get them to the relics. If your church is waning in either direct formation or even numbers of members, if you could just get yourself on eBay and find Peter's teeth, everything would be fine. You just have to raise the money to get yourself that, and everything would be okay. Now, I'm overstating that, but there was a sense where things themselves were charged with significance. So if you could get near them. The next time you're in Paris and you go to Notre Dame as it's being rebuilt, or you go across the way to Saint-Chapelle. Yeah, you go across beautiful stained glass. I mean, unbelievably beautiful stained glass. You stand in it, and it's like you're standing inside of a lantern. That thing was built very quickly, actually, and it was built because St. Louis received Jesus' crown of thorns. So that incredible building was built as a reliquary, for a reliquary. And if you go down to Chartres, you will see the same thing, incredible cathedral. Why was it built? Because they had Mary's cloak. And you can still see it behind the choir or another piece of it in the basement. There's a sense that the things themselves led to creating this. It's very hard for us modern people to even think that way. You wouldn't build a building because of the thing. You'd build it for its function or for some other reason. So you have to have this sense that things themselves are charged. And then the final one is that you have to have a sense that the self is porous. And what I mean by that is that things can get into the self. And we just tend not to believe this, or it's hard for us to believe this. A couple stories that illustrate this. I don't know if anyone watched. It's on PBS in the States, our public broadcasting channel. But the Victoria miniseries, I think it's going to be in season 3. Did anyone see this? If you saw season 2, it's about Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria in season 2 is going to have her first child. And she's also, the London Zoo has opened, and she is told she cannot go to the zoo as a pregnant woman. Because the idea as a pregnant woman is that if she goes to the zoo and sees an elephant, there's a very good possibility her child will come out with big ears. And this is historical. My colleague Amy Marga has been doing research on Christian tradition and mothering. And there are all sorts of stories that a mother with child should not see someone drunk in the street, or there's a good chance that their child will end up being having alcohol problems, being a drunk, they would say then. That you shouldn't be scared. If you're scared by a mouse, your baby could come out with a pointy nose and floppy mouse ears. This sense of the porousness. Or we could go back to the 4th century in Augustine. There's a story about Augustine that he got the flu or something. I don't know how old he was, 8 or 9. And he got the flu, and his mother was worried about him. His beloved mother, Monica, was worried. So she stripped him down naked, and she got him wet, and she rolled him in salt. The idea was he was sick, he was vulnerable, but if she could roll him in salt, the demons wouldn't be able to get into him. So my very bad joke is it's clear that demons like the sweet more than the savory. And you can barely laugh at my terrible joke. But that's part of my pedagogical point, is that I say this bad joke about demons, and I don't think, you can tell me later if this is true, very few of you did you get anxious. And none of you raised your hand and said, "Excuse me, sir, please do not insult the demons in our midst. We do not want to call them here. You put us all at risk if you talk like this." It's actually quite hard for me to think that I could make a joke about demons and that I could have a vendetta put on my head by a bunch of demons. I kind of believe in a demonology, I do, but it's hard for me to function day to day as if that is true. I could make all sorts of bad jokes. The closest thing we have to this, and this is a good, and I think one of the things we want to say is this is a gain. I have a daughter who's 12. She's lovely and just lovely, unlike the boy. She's just lovely. But, she's 12 and homework becomes difficult at times, and she's breaking down and overwhelmed with homework. And every time that this happens and she's breaking down and she's crying, never do my wife and I go, uh-oh, we better call the Catholic priest to come do an exorcism on our house, because Presbyterians or Lutherans couldn't do it. Only the Catholics could. But we never think that. We tend to think, oh, well, hormones. Oh, she didn't get enough sleep last night. Or she's just hungry. We have answers for her behavior that tend to be natural and material, not necessarily spiritual. The closest we get on our time to a kind of porous self is this classic Snickers commercial. Do you remember this commercial?
Mike, what is your deal, man?
Oh, come on, man. You've been riding me all day.
Mike, you're playing like Betty White out there.
That's not what your girlfriend said.
Baby.
Whoa.
Eat a Snickers. Better?
Better. How about that? That hurt.
You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers satisfies.
All right, classic commercial, but you can kind of see it there. You're not you when you're hungry. And this is what Taylor means by the difference between a porous self and what he calls a buffered self. That even our explanations for our behaviors or the constitution of our consciousness either, there's always some kind of other answer for it. Oh, it's not you. It's not you that feels that way. It's the fact that you're hungry. Your blood sugar is low. That we have answers for this. And he thinks this is a real gain. It's much easier to raise children. It's probably better for children that our answers for their odd behavior tend to be natural material ones, not necessarily spiritual ones. But this does take us somewhere different than our ancestors. And I don't want to actually glorify this past world, but it wasn't really hard to do faith formation. I mean, I'm overstating this, but it wasn't as hard to do it then. You can think, I've had this experience teaching confirmation, and maybe those of you who have taught confirmation have had this experience. I won't go into this too much because I honestly don't want to insult anyone, but there's an American comedian who does this, says he plays this game of course not, but maybe. And he says it's a very inappropriate game. He's like, I do it to pass time, but it's completely inappropriate, and I'm now going to tell you it. It's completely inappropriate. But he says, I do it with things like, let's say, peanut allergies. He says, peanut allergies. Of course. This is how the game goes. Of course. Of course. Every step should be taken in society that if anyone has a peanut allergy, every step should be taken to make sure no one is ever exposed to a peanut allergy. Of course. But he says, then it's my bad side comes in. I think, but maybe if a peanut's going to kill you, you're supposed to die. No, of course not. See, you can see how this is offensive. All right, I should not have told you that. But, and he goes on with this thing. Well, I was teaching confirmation with my high school students, and we got to, the way we did it in our church is that the kids would come up and they would kind of share their faith story. And this beautiful kid named Will came up, and he was going to share his story with the congregation. He has decided to go through confirmation. We had done a whole process of faith formation with him. He gets up, and he starts to share a story. And he says, what I guess I've learned from these 3 years of reading the Bible with Andy and kind of thinking about the Christian tradition is I guess what I just realized is whatever works for you. And, that's cool. And, the Bible's important. There's some good stuff, but I wouldn't believe all of it. I mean, come on. And, I don't know. I just, whatever works. And as he's saying this, I'm sliding, beautiful kid, I'm sliding down in my chair, and I start to have an existential crisis because I'm like, I literally fly around the world and tell people how to do this. And Will's a beautiful kid, but this is what he's saying. So I'm sliding down as he's saying this, and I start to play with myself. Of course not, but maybe. Of course, the theology that we should continue to proclaim is the theology of God's abundant love. Of course, the biblical text witnesses to a God who is filled with ultimate grace. But maybe if you don't tell 13-year-old boys they're going to burn in hell forever, they never listen to a word you say. Of course not. No, of course not. So in some sense, I don't want to push this too far, but in some sense, faith formation was easier in a secular zero world because the stakes were incredibly high. If you didn't believe this, if you didn't follow this, if you didn't learn these prayers, your mortal soul was in danger. As an advance, as a good thing, we tend not to believe that. And we actually find it abusive to push such perspectives on to young people. But it does make things more difficult. So if that's secular zero, it then moves us to our next secular, which we could call secular one. And this is where we'd start to see a divide. And we start to see a divide between the public and the private. And this is a long conversation that it's an intricate one, and the ball, like with the dog, will disappear if we talk too long about this. So I don't want to go too far into this. But I do want us to think of it this way. Think about, and this still kind of hangs on in our cultures, that there's usually 4 things that you're told you're not supposed to talk about at a dinner party, that it's impolite, right? Those 4 things. You're not supposed to talk about money at a dinner party. You're not supposed to talk, you're not supposed to talk about sex at a dinner party. That's off bounds. You're actually not supposed to talk, it's supposed to be rude to talk about politics at a dinner party. Now, I live in a country where that's nearly impossible. But you try not to talk about politics at a dinner party. And then the 4th thing that's on that list that you're not supposed to talk about at a dinner party is religion. It's impolite to talk about religion. Why is it impolite to talk about religion or any of those 4 things? Because we assume those 4 things are a private matter. They are not for public conversation. Those are an individual, private thing. And so what happens in this secular one world is that we start to see this movement of a divide between the public and the private. So now religion, faith, belief becomes something that's embedded in your own private life. And that those who even are running the larger institutions of the society, they don't necessarily need to believe. In a secular zero world, the king, the queen, the lords, they had to be believing people. Even if they didn't, they had to at least seem like they were believing people. Now in a secular one world, it's maybe not necessary if people believe or if people don't believe. So this does, in some sense, a secular one world becomes the rise of the denomination. The denomination becomes pretty important here. And we see some transitions away from some things and some adding of things, but we start to see, that what's important is not things themselves, that things aren't enchanted with meaning and significance, but what matters now is wills. Will you will to be part of this? Will you will that going to church is something significant for you? Will you will, even though you're only 14 or 15, will you will for the rest of your life to be a Mennonite? Will you decide for that? Will you will to be part of this congregation? Wills become very important. And this becomes really significant. This holds on with us. If you are part of denominational leadership, this is huge. Every denominational official knows that the denomination, as a kind of modern institutional structure, can only exist for one more generation. And what I mean by that is if the next generation does not will to enact their life in that denominational affiliation, it will not exist. This is why in the denomination my school's part of, the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which sociologically is not an evangelical group, but it's so confusing. Just go with me here. But every 3 years, they have a thing called the Youth Gathering. It's a big event where they bring all the young people of the ELCA come to it. It's usually in a big dome event. There's 20,000 people at this thing. The denomination, someone could get the numbers on this, but it's something like the annual budget for the youth gathering that only happens every 3 years is $3 million. $3 million. And that doesn't even include how much local congregations have to raise to be able to take a group of young people, which they start raising money 2 years, 3 years in advance for this thing. Now, why do they do it? Why do they actually do it? They know that that's a lot of money, but it's a good investment. Because if the next generation does not decide to enact their lives as Lutherans, there is no Lutheran church. So I was at one a few years ago, and it was like day 3. It was in San Antonio at the San Antonio, what is that called? The San Antonio Dome. Is that what it's called? The Alamo Dome. Thank you very much. There's a Spurs fan around here. It was at the Alamo Dome. It was packed, and it was like day 3, like I said, and the kids were buzzing. And it's usually a big production, rock concert-y kind of thing. And these 2 high school girls were in front of me, and I just happened to be walking behind them. And one of the girls was walking with her friend, and they're friendly, having a great time together. And one of them did the whole thing where you kick your friend without them seeing it, you know? So she kind of slyly kicked her. And the other girl knew right away that she kicked her. And she kicked her, and she looked at her, and she did, this is her exact word. She looked at her, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you just kicked me." She wasn't Kim Kardashian, but close. And she's like, "I can't believe you kicked me." And then she said these words. She said, "That's such an un-Lutheran thing to do." And I was blown away. And I kept thinking to myself, un-Lutheran? An un-Lutheran thing to do? And I thought, what do you mean? What does she mean, un-Lutheran? I mean, if her friend would have turned to her and put her arm around her and said, "Hey, I just want to tell you, whatever they're saying in there, we're justified by our works," that would have been un-Lutheran. But she just kicked her. "That's an un-Lutheran thing to do," she says to her. And then I realized the denomination got exactly what they wanted for their $3 million. That this is the sense that these girls were in such the glow of this that they got the main point of the event. The main point of the event, and if you did, I haven't done this, but my guess is if you did research, if you did qualitative research, even quantitative research, and ask young people their biggest takeaway from this event of seeing this dome of 20,000 people, what they will say, their biggest takeaway is, "I never knew there were so many Lutherans." Now that isn't insignificant. That's very important. $3 million important? But it's necessary for the denomination because if the next generation does not will to be Lutheran, there is no denomination. Now, I'm just using Lutheran because for most of you, the majority of you, it's not you. But that could, I'm sure, be enacted as Mennonite or whatever. But you see how will becomes very important here. Will, they will. So in some sense, faith formation becomes how do you get the next generation or how do you get their parents to will to participate? To will to make this a significant part even of their own story or their own commitments. It becomes, faith formation transitions from, to be very simplistic, from getting people in front of the relics maybe to how do you get inside their consciousness and get them to see this thing in their private lives as important. Now to show you this transition from things to wills, I want to show you a clip from this is from the news. This was right after Notre Dame started on fire. And they interview the dean of, you'll hear them say it, the Episcopal Church in Paris. And she's talking about the relics. And listen to how she talks about them. And I don't show you this so we can be critical of her. I actually think she's probably right. I actually believe what she's saying. But you'll see how different it is from that secular zero perspective of things themselves being charged with a certain spiritual force.
Led is Dean of the American Cathedral in Paris.
It's brought out in all of us how much we care, not just about the building, which is gorgeous and historic, but about what it stands for. Paris, France, Europe, the world, tradition, Christian faith at its finest. Christian faith that endures.
The Dean is grateful that so many relics survived.
The relics are important, whether or not it really was Jesus' crown of thorns, for instance. Who knows? What's important is that it was a focus of faith, a focus of people's prayers for hundreds of years. So the things themselves are not so important as what they stand for, what they mean to people, the faith they evoke.
At present,
All right, so again, I think I probably intellectually agree with her. But you see the radical difference where she says, well, the things themselves, was it really? Well, we don't know. But what matters is those things people willed. They were part of their willing of the importance of the faith. So that's why they have significance. Now, again, I don't know who's right and wrong within that. Just a very big difference than a secular zero world. The other thing that happens in this time is that we transition from being in a cosmos to being in a universe. And what this means is maybe the best way to think about this is remember when this happened? January 31st, 2018. Do you remember this? If you're a pastor, of course you remember this because you didn't have a spare moment in your life. Your life was so busy because everyone in your church kept calling you, emailing you, and texting you and saying, Pastor, on the 31st is going to be a super red blood moon. And I know God has something to say to us. What does this mean, Pastor? Tell me what this means. Remember how busy you were? No, you weren't because no one cared. And that's the point. If you were living in that secular zero world, the phenomenon even of the world itself, a eclipse, a blood moon, was a message from God. There was something being spoken to you. This meant something. Should you have a child or should you not? Does this mean that a terrible travesty is about to arise or doesn't it? Do we need a new king or a new queen? What does this all mean? We tend not to think that way now. We don't live in a cosmos that even the natural phenomenon speaks to us. We know what these are. These are certain cosmological laws that occur, and we have a kind of answer for this. Or to borderline show you too many video clips, let me illustrate this by showing you a clip from Jimmy Kimmel. So I've shown you Stephen Colbert. It's a law in America that you have to balance your late night host. But I think you'll find this humorous, especially as Canadians looking in at the American system.
Well, it was a strange and mystical day in the universe. Last night, lasting into early this morning, we had a blue moon, a blood moon, a supermoon, and a full lunar eclipse all at the same time. The moon pulled out all the stops to try to get us to look up from our phones. This is something, I've been excited about this for a few days. I read about it, and then I marked it in my calendar. I told my wife, I was like, we got to get it. I wrote super blood blue moon, 5:29 a.m. That was supposed to be the ideal time. And this hasn't happened for 152 years. It's a rare thing, so I wanted to get up to see it. So I set my alarm for 5:25, giving me 4 minutes to get up and get out on the balcony. Alarm went on. I turn it off. I get up. I go to the bathroom. And then I come out of the bathroom, I get right back into bed and go to sleep. I forgot about it immediately. In between the time I was in the bathroom, it totally left my mind. And I have to say, I'm actually kind of glad I didn't see it because the moon, if you think about it, the moon is a little bit of a show-off. Every month, it's another thing we have to watch. You don't see the sun pulling this kind of crap. The sun just hangs out. I'm up, I'm down, I'll see you tomorrow. The moon's like, look at me, put on your safety glasses. I'm blocking the sun, everybody. Interestingly, in ancient times, they believed that the confluence of a blood moon and a lunar eclipse meant that a terrible leader had risen up to torment his people. Did you see the State of the Union last night? President Trump delivered his first State of the Union address.
But you see the point, right? First of all, this incredible phenomenon happens. He can wake up, go to the bathroom, and totally forget about it. Doesn't mean anything. I referenced my colleague Amy Marga. She was saying that she got her boys up. She had 2 small boys, got them up to show them the super red blood moon, and they were out on the street. She says, you guys see that? This is amazing. You know, in the olden days, people would think that this meant something, that God had a message for us or something was going to happen. And the boys looked at her like, yeah, but Mom, it's just the moon, right? Like, that's all it is. It's just the moon, right? And she's like, yeah, it's just the moon. And that becomes a very different kind of way we make meaning. And so he can just easily go back to bed. And then he says, of course, in ancient times, we thought that the confluence of these things meant an evil leader had risen up. And that becomes really good fodder for a joke. Maybe it's true. But we see a very different world when we live in this cosmos. So that leads us to this sense of secular one. But this, you can see how this becomes more difficult then. That faith formation becomes more difficult in secular one. But where this gets doubled down is it enters us into what Taylor calls secular two, or we could call S2. And this becomes a divide between the religious and the a-religious. And in many ways, I think this is almost where every faith formation program that's come out in the last few years, and that's usually grabbed onto by denominational leaders and others, is usually stuck in this kind of secular two perspective. So secular two, by definition, is secular two means fewer and fewer people are going to church. That's what it means. That fewer and fewer people are willing to be part of these religious institutions. And we tend to see our problem, I think, across the West as a secular two issue. The issue is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. Our young people, their parents, that we have a rise of, sometimes it's called the nuns. We have also a rise, less popular research, but that's out there, of a rise of people who are late baby boomers who are calling themselves the duns, like they're not ever going back to church. And that we usually see this as our issue. And it is a really kind of doubling down on this sense of needing to willfully be loyal and committed to this. And so in this divide between the religious and a-religious, when we see our issue as this secular two issue, is that fewer and fewer people are going to church, the drive becomes, how do we win people's loyal enactment into this religious community that we're at? How do we get them committed? How do we get them to actually be part of this? Now, I referenced Hartmut Rosa in my Q&A earlier this morning, but one of the things that Rosa says happens is that in this speed where things keep speeding up and we start to recognize that there's a battle between maybe committing to this or committing to that, is we tend to have this way in the midst of the speed up to see everything in the world as a resource, and that the issue is resources. And when you talk to people within mainline denominations particularly, but this happens, at least in my country, in evangelical congregations as well, is when we start to talk about the issues the church faces, it almost always slides into the church is facing a crisis of resources. We are losing resources. We don't have as many resources as we used to. We need young people involved because young people are a resource. Or the way you keep young people involved is you just have to give them more resources. A better youth room, a better hair gelled youth pastor. Like, these are the resources you need to actually keep them coming. And we become obsessed with this sense of resources. What's really interesting is in Kenda Creasy Dean's book, Almost Christian. I don't know if you've seen this book, Almost Christian. It's a beautiful book, and Kenda did a great job with it. But at the very end of it, and I read a lot of earlier versions for it, so I'm not sure it's still in there, but the very last chapter was a very kind of sad chapter. She kind of reflected on where we were at. And you can get it from the title, Almost Christian, that she thinks that we're in a pretty difficult spot right now. And she starts the book with this really haunting comment where she says, over my lifetime, and she's thinking, she started youth ministry maybe in the early 80s and has gone through this, and she said, in my lifetime, we've never, in Protestantism, in North American Protestantism, we've never done more for young people than we have these last 3 or 4 decades. And yet the situation seems worse. I mean, that's pretty depressing. But one of the reasons it's depressing is because we continue to see it as a resource issue. We could just get more resources. If we could see our young people as resources, that if we could find ways, as even churches become places of entrepreneurship and innovation, we could innovate more resources, and that would upend decline. Now, you're hearing me start to be kind of snarky towards this position. I actually don't think it's our issue. It is an issue, and I don't want to be naive. As we had our conversation, I'm in a theological mainline institution, and I am more than aware that if the denomination loses another, I don't know, there's some tipping point at maybe 15, 18% of members, all of a sudden the whole structures will start to go away. And in America, we need the clergy roster needs enough people on it so that we can go to our health care and buy health care. So if all of a sudden there are fewer pastors because there are fewer members in the church and we can't, as a block, go and buy affordable health care, our premiums will go way up and it will have a ripple effect that could take down the whole denomination. I know it as a seminary. If we lose another 20% of students, how will we keep the doors open. I mean, there are tipping points. So I don't want to be naive about this. But I think one of the really helpful things that Charles Taylor is pointing us to is that this is an issue. And if you are a church professional, like all of us in this room, this is an issue for you. And we shouldn't be naive. We are not living in the golden age of church resources. But he's not sure this is really what it means to live in a secular age. It's part of it, but it's not really necessarily what it means to really live in a secular age. Now, one of the things that's hard about being a pastor is you feel this. You feel responsible for these institutions. You know the need to kind of meet budget, or you're aware that you are the youth pastor and you have a hard time having a youth group of more than 6 kids, and you have people always asking you, why can't you get more of our kids to come? You feel that burden. But part of the problem is the more we chase this as our issue, the more it locks us into certain cul-de-sacs to see things. And we just become more anxious about how we accrue more resources, and ultimately we don't see the bigger issue. And the bigger issue that Taylor wants to point us to, or what he wants to say it really means to live in a secular age, is what he calls secular 3. That the age that we live in is a secular 3 age. And I think it's secular 3 that makes being a pastor so hard. And I think it's secular 3 that makes it hard to do faith formation. Secular 2 has an illusion that it's hard to do faith formation because they're just not showing up. So if we could just get the resources and find the model, we could get them to come. But Taylor says their issue isn't that fewer and fewer people are going to church. The issue is secular 3. And he defines secular 3 like this. Secular 3, if secular 1 is the divide between public and private, if secular 2 is that fewer and fewer people are going to church, and we almost feel a battle between religious spaces and a-religious spaces. And let me just reiterate that. I'm not trying to backtrack, but we can feel this, especially those of us who have some connection to younger people. We always feel this. How could we get young people to commit to a religious space over and against an a-religious space? And you'll sometimes hear, particularly conservative Protestant youth pastors say things like, well, they won't quite use this language, but if in the a-religious space, kids will get up at 5:30 in the morning for a hockey practice, then they should get up at 5:30 in the morning to read their Bible. And you always want to pat them on the head and say, good luck with that. But we always want to find a way to beat back or to win space in this secular 2 perspective. But Taylor says that's not the issue. Our issue is secular 3, and secular 3 is defined as this. Secular 3 is the contesting and fragilizing of all belief. What it means to live in a secular 3 age means all belief is contested. Each of us knows, even in this room, people who have given years and years of their lives to this, people who have spent money getting an education. You all know very easily, you could all imagine giving this all up and living in a completely different way. And you're actually not sure that your non-church-going atheist neighbor, or maybe even your Hindu neighbor doesn't have it right. And you're a little bit haunted by that. Maybe that's a better way to live your life. So it's the contesting of all belief, but it's ultimately for him the fragilizing of all belief. All belief becomes fragilized. And there's really, he thinks, no way behind the sense that all of our beliefs become fragilized. Now, this is what makes, to me, Charles Taylor so unique and interesting, is that it's never a one-way street. So what he wants to say is, in this kind of secular age, all belief is fragilized. You can't help it. If you're a believing person, at some point, you are haunted by questions like, do I really believe this? Or was this just the family I grew up in? Or is faith true? Or is this just an evolutionary trick? False pattern recognition. Maybe that's all religion is. You can't help but be haunted by that way, to be crossed up, to be fragilized in those beliefs. You can't help that. There's only a very small percentage of people who never doubt and believe without ever doubting. And those people are called American fundamentalists. But besides those people, there's no one else who doesn't doubt it sometimes. But this is what makes Taylor so interesting. He thinks it works the other way as well. So if you're someone who says you're living in Toronto or you're living in Brooklyn or something, and come on. Religion, it's just an old relic of the past. We are advanced people, whether romantically in a kind of artistic way or rationally in a scientific way. Listen, no, you don't believe this. You absolutely don't believe this. You are assured in your belief of unbelieving. Taylor says you get your unbelief fragilized as well. You can't help not having your own unbelief fragilized. So you know this isn't true. You absolutely know this isn't true. But then you have your first child. And you pick that baby up for the first time, and you are overwhelmed by the possibility that there might be something more. Or you bury your mother. And at the funeral, you talk about, and you even reminisce with your siblings how my mom used to always sing you this weird 80s song. And she used to dance in the kitchen and sing this song. And you cry about it. And you celebrate her life. You set your alarm, you go to bed, you wake up the next day, you have asked your Siri to just wake you up to a random song from Pandora or something, and boom, there it is, that exact song. And you're haunted by maybe there's something speaking to you. And you try to push it down and say, well, that just must be some weird algorithm. Or, I mean, my gosh, Amazon is just listening to everything I say. But you also wonder, is there something more? Is there a possibility? Is there something reaching out for me? So his point is every believer finds themselves in doubt. But sometimes every doubter believes. And so there's only a very small percentage of people in this kind of secular 3 age who never believe, who never, ever believe. They're very, very small percentage of people, very, very small sliver of people, and they are called British New Atheists. Everyone else, even in their unbelief, sometimes finds themselves believing. So there's both a positive and a negative element to this secular 3 perspective. And the negative element, it is a loss of transcendence as a kind of referent to our lives. It is the loss of transcendence, the doubting of transcendence. To wonder if maybe all our lives are is just natural material, that there's nothing beyond that. That's the negative element. The positive element, or we could call it, think about these as negative charge, positive charge. The positive element is there's a deep, deep yearning for meaning. A deep yearning to seek for some kind of purpose, even if you think there may be no purpose, that you have some longing to find purpose and meaning. So there's this kind of two-way fragilization that exists. So I'm just going to go for a couple more minutes, and then we're going to do the whole Lord of the Rings thing, and we're going to shut this down. But this will hopefully open us up to some conversation, because one of the ways Taylor wants to describe this, which I think is very helpful for people in ministry, is he's saying in this secular 3 world, where all beliefs are contested, where belief itself becomes contested, and even your belief you don't believe becomes contested and doubted. He says what we do, however, all inherit is what he calls the imminent frame, that we all live in an imminent frame. And this is how he defines an imminent frame. He says an imminent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It is a circumscribed space of the modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. So what he's saying is that we all inherit a kind of cultural frame of things we should expect, of ways to make quick meaning, that we inherit this kind of imminent frame. And it's an imminent frame that tends not to have answers for things with transcendence. So to give you just like a superficial example of this, a few weeks ago, about a month ago, I was sitting in my living room reading a book, and my dog barked because someone had came to our door. And there's these two, I went to the door to see what was going on, and there were these 2 men, nicely dressed men, and it looked like they had iPads in their hands or some nice leather folders. And one of the men was standing up on our stoop and the other behind, and the man says, as I went to the door, he says, "Hello. We're just going around to our neighbors because we have some really good news." And my imagination went directly to, really? And I started thinking, what could this good news be? And I started to think, tacos. There's a taco place down the street, and they are going to have a sale. Tuesday tacos are going to be $1. That's what I thought. And then I thought, well, maybe, this is like in instant, seconds. And I think, oh, no. These guys are dressed far too sharply for tacos. And I thought, this is it. high-speed internet, like 1 gig internet. That's what they're going to tell me, that I can buy into 1 gig internet. And what I'm trying to say is all my imagination of what good news equaled was a natural, imminent reality, that had something to do with market or food or high-speed internet. And of course, what these men said, God bless their souls, they said, we're Jehovah's Witnesses, and we would like to tell you about what we believe. And I thought, I ain't got no time for this. And I actually did. I said, thank you, guys, but I have stuff to do. But immediately my imagination goes and is bound in this kind of sense of an imminent frame. Or to give you maybe a better example of this, but maybe not as hip, cool example, let me show you some lyrics from a British pop star named Lily Allen. The song's about 8 years old now, so it's not very cool. But it significantly points to this. And so she has this song called The Fear, and she says this. I think it's an interesting, in-your-face, kind of irreverent lyric. And she is kind of totally in your face. And she's saying, life's about film stars and less about mothers. But it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic, and that's what makes my life so effing fantastic. All right, now this is all sarcasm, kind of in your face, but I don't know what that means, to be completely honest. And it's probably always quite dangerous to exegete pop stars' lyrics. So I'm not exactly sure what packing plastic means. I can guess. It either means she has a credit card with a very large credit limit on it, or probably more likely it means she's had her breasts enhanced, and that becomes the measure of a good life. That becomes the measure of what makes life good. But this is where it gets more interesting. She says, now I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. It's how I'm programmed to function. Now here's the imminent frame. Now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. But everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. I'm not a saint. I'm not a sinner. But everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Now I don't want to disparage her. I think she's actually pointing to something in a very kind of relevant, interesting way. But it's a very different frame that she's saying, and she's pointing to us. If you live in a supernatural frame, like you would in a secular zero world, as opposed to an imminent frame like we live in, you spent most of your life wondering, heaven or hell, saint or sinner, where am I? Remember, not to reference Luther again, but Luther pretty much went cuckoo trying to figure this out. Like, it kept him up at night. Am I a saint? Am I a sinner? What does God think of me? How can I make sure God thinks good of me? What am I supposed to do? He kind of did go mad trying to figure this out. But then, in an incredibly genius theological way, he came out with a really important doctrinal breakthrough. And it's called Luther's Kimmel, where he realized it isn't whether you are a saint or a sinner. It's actually that you are simultaneously both saint and sinner. And it was, at least to the Germanic nations, an incredibly relevant doctrinal perspective that gave them great hope. And it stuck with those Germanic nations across Europe for hundreds of years, all the way until you get to this British pop star. All right, that's giving her too much credit. But you get to her, and what does she say? Saint or sinner? Things that across the West for hundreds of years people really cared about? Meh. I don't really care. These aren't constructs and categories that even ignite my imagination. But that doesn't mean she's not crossed up with fear. Doesn't mean that the imminent frame has protected her from even existential terror. The existential terror just isn't what a good, divine, powerful God thinks. What actually makes her quite frightened is that swimsuit season's coming. And what are people going to think of her body? She wakes up in the night, not like Luther going, what does God think of me? How will God judge me? She wakes up in the middle of the night and says, what kind of self am I creating to be? What do people think of myself? And this is what he means by the imminent frame. It's not less significant or more significant, but it's just very different. The things that haunt her are more natural and material. This becomes quite a bit more difficult to think about how you do faith formation in this kind of world of the imminent frame. Wherever we do faith formation, we do it inside of the presumptions of this imminent frame. And that becomes, I think, much more difficult. All right, so I think I'm going to conclude. We have about 15 minutes. I have a song that I want to play for you. And I think this will launch us into, we'll just use this as kind of our benediction into Q&A for about 5 minutes. So let me set up this song, because the song I should play for you is a Lily Allen song, but that would be too obvious. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to play a song for you by a group that I don't think any of you have heard of. If you've heard of them, you are cooler than me. Someone showed me this song, and I thought I have no sense that this person has ever read any of Charles Taylor, but it feels like they imbue it in a certain way. So it's a band. It's a band called Purple Mountains, and it's a song called Margaritas at the Mall. And I don't think I have to set it up any more than this, that I have to apologize to you. And I have to apologize deeply and just warn you, because what's going to happen is you're going to hear this song. It's not a music video. You're just going to see the lyrics come up. You're going to hear this song, see the lyrics. And I have to apologize to you, and I hope you'll be okay with this, because this song will get so deeply caught in your mind that you will be singing it for the next 2 weeks, and you will hate me for it. But what I want you to do is, when you wake up at 2 in the morning and you're singing Margaritas at the Mall, what I want you to do is pray. I want you to stop, and I want you to pray, and I want you to say, God, do you want me to buy an Andy Root book right now? That's what I want you to do. Okay, I'm kidding. That was a gross consumer joke. All right, so I do think this is profound. I'll say something about this artist after showing it, because it's also interesting who this artist is. But just sit back. What lyric strikes you? I think what we'll then do is just take this in to Q&A. Maybe I'll have 1 or 2 words, and then we'll just open it up to your questions. So here is Margaritas at the Mall.
Drawn up all my findings, and I warn you they are candid. My everyday begins with reminders I've been stranded on this planet where I've landed, beneath this gray as granite sky. A place I wake up blushing like I'm ashamed to be alive. How long can the world go on under such a subtle God? How long can the world go on with no new word from God? See the plot of the flawed individual looking for a nod from God, trotting the sod of the visible with no new word from God. We're just drinking margaritas at the mall. That's what this stuff adds up to after all. Magenta, orange, acid green, peacock blue and burgundy. Drinking margaritas at the mall. Standing in the shadow of the signpost on the road, 50 gates of understanding, 49 are closed. Yes, I guess this time I really hit that number on the nose. What I'd give for an hour with the power on the throne. How long can the world go on under such a subtle God? How long can the world go on with no new word from God? See the plot of the flawed individual looking for a nod from God, trotting the sod of the visible with no new word from God. We're just drinking margaritas at the mall, 'cause happy hours drinking margaritas at the mall. Drinking margaritas at the mall.
All right, it's become your new favorite song, maybe. But it will be stuck in your head. But it's a powerful song, and this is not someone who's writing in any way from a Christian perspective at all. As a matter of fact, he's a poet, which connects to Taylor's work as well, and we can talk about that. But he's a poet, and tragically, it's a bummer, but tragically he committed suicide just about 4 or 5 months ago. And so you can see part of what Taylor is saying is there is a certain modern problem. He calls this the malaise of imminence. And this guy voices it in a really significant way. How long can the world go on with no new word from God? How long can the world go on like this? And but what you get in gain, you get margaritas at the mall. And that is a safer world. That is a more maybe dependable world in some way. So you do get the gains of margaritas at the mall, but you also get the haunting, the transcendent quality of life kind of sucked from it. All right, so we have ourselves about 7 minutes, which I totally blew, giving you a good 20 minutes to discuss, but we'll have plenty of time tomorrow. But let's do this. Turn to someone next to you and just check in. Where are you at? What questions are starting to bubble within you? What seemed confusing? Just spend about a minute just checking in with someone who looks interesting to talk to next to you. And this is where, if you're a severe introvert, this is where you pretend your phone is ringing. So.